It's a great honor to welcome our friends from Heritage Foundation, and especially for Ambassador Terry Bernstein, and also at such early time. Also, very glad to see Ed Feulner, a friend of CCG. And so I agree with you, Walter. It's really such a challenging time, but also important, critical time for us to review the bilateral relations. So we are very very happy that our two think tanks get together, and particularly with the presence of Ambassador Terry Bernstein, also our co-chair, Ambassador He Yafei and Ambassador Su Ge. And so all of us here, I hope we can have some very internal discussion. Also, all the other distinguished fellows from Heritage Foundation. What I think is really it's a great timing. We know that we're getting to 2022. We know that the world is in pandemic. We know that bilateral relations are at a historical low. But we also know that this year is a midterm election, and looks like the Democrats is not really making a lot of policy shifting on China or any major changes. And then probably we're going to have a midterm election, and then probably Republican may come back, and then we may get in the next term of a U.S. election. And then where are we going for the grand China policy for the U.S. and of course for China too? I mean, how we can continue this most important bilateral relation. So I think there's a lot of issues how we can properly manage those hot spots, but on the other hand, maintain a really great, frank and attractive dialogue and discussion. So I think this is really important that we can have a very frank discussion, but also trying to see how we can, for the next 2 years and even before the major election, or for the next U.S. government presidential election, how we can shape up the new policy focus and the framework, and probably the most important framework for the history of mankind. And I know Ed has founded this brilliant think tank, Heritage, has played a historical so much role in the U.S. And the global history, and of course CCG is also trying to do those kind of bridging and communication and dialogue. So really, I'm very thankful for American colleagues to join us so early in the morning. So perhaps maybe if I could, I invite Minister He, Ambassador He, to say a few words, and then we would love to hear from Ed and also Ambassador Terry Bernstein and also Ambassador Su Ge. So those are four, I think, are more heavyweights to share some of your views, and then we can have a more discussion by our fellows, by our colleagues to join us. And I think this is really important. So we take good notes of that, and maybe we can make a proper recommendation to our own government. And so that's why we take some notes and record just for our own purpose. So this is really a closed door discussion. So maybe we start with Minister He. Maybe you say a few words, and then we'll invite Ed to give your speech, and Ambassador Terry Bernstein, and then Ambassador Su Ge, and then we can come back to the discussion. So how about that, Walter? What do you think?
Well, the only two things I want to mention. One is we're not really that formal. So, if Ambassador Bernstein has something he wants to chime in, he's free to do that. Okay. But we don't really have any presentations or anything prepared. No. But the other thing I'd like to, that you kind of touched on there, that maybe I could just flag here from the beginning. You talked a lot about American politics. If we're being frank, can we talk more about Chinese politics? I mean, one of the frustrations I think I've always had about exchanges with the Chinese visitors is they always want to talk about American politics, but they never talk about Chinese politics. We hired a guy last year, Michael Cunningham, who's on the call, whose job at Heritage is to follow Chinese politics. He lived 7 years in China. He speaks beautiful Mandarin and focused on that for us. So he might have might be a good ear to hear. So I hope we can talk about that. Again, if we're being frank, let's be frank across the board.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's fine. We have no limits. I mean, we are both open to all topics, including Chinese politics. Maybe Ambassador He, you want to say a few words?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Walter, too, for opening this dialogue. And I think it's important to touch base again with heritage. I remember the meeting in Washington, quite frankly, and actually the debate was heated, particularly on Taiwan at the time. I remember that meeting. I'll be very brief in my, as Henry has asked, opening remarks, if I can say that. When we view the prospect of China-US relationship in the new year or beyond, there is a question we need to ask ourselves. That is, are we in a new Cold War, or are we witnessing the beginning of a new Cold War? I read quite a few pieces by experts, both in the US and China. Many say yes, some say yes and no, and I would tentatively say no with a but. I remember that during the online summit between two presidents, President Xi expressed his view on no Cold War, and President Biden agreed. I think both of them expressed their aversion to a new Cold War, with Xi emphasizing the point that in particular, US needed to translate words into action because we see things on the contrary. On China, China's strategy of peaceful development, you may believe it's rhetoric, it's real, it's quite clear. And several decades of opening up reforms and joining globalization, etc., has proven that there is no reason to doubt that China will discontinue on that path, because by so doing, China really believes it serves its own interest and that of the world in promoting lasting peace and growing prosperity. China has been trying hard in bilateral relations with the US to seek cooperation as much as possible and avoid conflict and confrontation also as much as possible in its interaction with the US. Of course, China has made very clear its determination that it will continue to safeguard or defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, especially on the issue of Taiwan. Walter mentioned US politics. I'm sorry, I have to mention US politics again because it is of great interest in China, to Chinese experts. On the part of America, the moment of singularity, quote unquote, arose from the implosion of the former USSR that ended Cold War. The US enjoyed many years of world hegemony, honestly, as last man standing, with the end of history again, quote unquote, referring to the end of the competition of political ideologies and systems. I think the intoxication still lingers on. And when the US faces a growing China in the whirlwinds of globalization, etc., and also a relative decline, I emphasize relative decline in American power to maintain and exercise global hegemony, of course, resulting from overreach. We have a sense in China that the United States has become more anxious, and the yearning to push China down has risen accordingly. Even though, from my point of view, those who are really diehard in targeting China as a strategic competitor, i.e. foe, still constitute a minority. Walter may suggest otherwise, it's bipartisan, etc. But I think die-hard people, people are really believe that China is the enemy, is still a minority. Of course, there are good news and bad news, as always. The good news is, from what I can see, the lowest ebb seems to be over in China-US relationship. I understand we have experienced difficult times, really very difficult times as compared to what we had in the past, but the worst is over. The two presidents have had a few video conversations and giving clear guidance to where this relationship should go, especially on the red line that we should not be engaged in a new Cold War. Talks at different levels have been resumed, though the exchanges were sometimes very sharp and candid. That might be a little different from past times. Cooperation in trade, in finance, in climate change with joint declaration in Glasgow, and nuclear non-proliferation, for instance, with recent joint statement on nuclear disarmament by P5, all bear testimony to the fact that despite huge differences, we still could cooperate. And I think the country will continue to find areas with converging interests to consolidate, to find and consolidate bilateral and multilateral cooperation. Unfortunately, bad news is still there. And the bad news is, one, economic and technological decoupling is emerging. Like great rhino on the horizon is dangerous. And the US is bent on building alliances, big or small, based on ideological lines. That is also worrying to China. We saw AUKUS, quadruple alliance, US, India, Japan, Australia, and also the summit of democracies, etc., etc. And China has been, unfortunately, still the victim receiving end of bashing. We have been labeled again and again illiberal, non-democratic, autocratic, etc., etc., to name a few. That reflects still, I heard it during my times, but still it is still going on, that reflects the deep political and ideological bias against China. This time probably from
it happens to all be true.
Mm-hmm.
It is non-democratic, etc., right? I mean,
you believe it's true, we do not believe it's true. So that's debatable. At least we can debate on it. I think that kind of relationship, to build different camps based on ideology, is extremely harmful to our goal of having a healthy and robust bilateral relationship. And in the end, I think these kind of things will boomerang to hurt the US too, because our two countries, through years, decades of globalization, are so intertwined economically, and also very much intertwined in building and maintaining at least a functionable global governance system. That is in tatters, unfortunately. Geopolitical competition is a reality, but also is a monster. We should avoid it as much as we can. And most importantly, it should not be allowed to hijack this most important bilateral relationship between China and the United States. Two major economies, 40% of global GDP, and the two most, I would say, most important global powers. I will stop here. I think you will need to discuss these issues.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ambassador He. Yeah, I think that absolutely. I mean, Heritage is a great think tank in the U.S. for a long time, and Ed had founded this, for many years. You have experienced so many, political and ups and downs relations. So Ed, maybe if you could share your views, historically and where we are going and where we're going forward. Because I remember last time in your office, we actually talked a bit about, can we cooperate on the infrastructure? We're now, U.S. President Biden has called Build Back Better, and European called the European Gateway. So maybe China and U.S. can work on something. Ed, maybe your turn, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Henry, and it's a great pleasure for me to be a part of this discussion, and particularly to see my longtime advisor, friend, and colleague, Governor Ambassador Branstad, with whom I'm working right now on a project in his home state of West Branch, Iowa, the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, and we appreciate his leadership very much on that. Look, my first point, and I think everyone on the call is starting to realize this, Ambassador, Minister, I take some exception to what you said, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the first thing is, the U.S.-China relationship is not going to go back to the good old days of George W. Bush or Barack Obama. There's a new mood in Washington, and it's not just right-wing conservatives like Tom Cotton. It's also mainstream liberal Democrats like Mark Warner from Virginia, who gets together with Cotton, who says, hey, we have to face a growing and challenging China in so many different areas. I would just point that, and I'm one of the people, going back 20 some years ago, when I called together the heads of Brookings and AEI and CSIS, and we had a joint press conference saying, yes, China should enter WTO. Yes, China should be given most favored nation status. Yes, and China's done amazing things in those intervening several decades in terms of lifting up its own population, et cetera. But one of the if China in fact is the second largest economy in the world, when is China going to give up the kind of built-in advantages that it designs for itself by remaining a, quote, developing country? The Republic of Korea doesn't do that anymore, but you get concessions in terms of tariff, in terms of respect for intellectual property, et cetera, for being a developing country. And frankly, and I've said this to my Chinese friends before, if the DPRK is not controlled in terms of its nuclear capabilities, and they fired another nuclear rocket toward the west coast of the United States yesterday, if that's not brought under some control, the likelihood of South Korea, of Japan, of Taiwan, of other neighbors talking about, hey, maybe we need to be nuked too. And that's not going to be helpful to China. It's not going to be helpful to the world. So maybe we can do something concretely and talk about how we can both work together in some of those very specific areas. And again, it's not the good old days, and it's not just me as a Trump person talking right now. AUKUS was not a Trump deal. AUKUS is a Biden deal. The new reaffirmation of the U.S.-China, of the U.S.-Japan 2-2 equal partners has just been reaffirmed within the last couple days by Biden and by Tokyo. This is not, again, right conservatives. This is across the board in terms of the American perception of what's going on strategically with China. And I've not really gotten into specifics on intellectual property and things like that, where we still have fundamental differences. But that's enough, I guess, of pointing out what some of the problems are. And let's see if we can come up with some solutions. And thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks, Ed. That was great. Let me, before we go on, can I just see anybody else on the American side here that wants to chime in?
My hope is that we can even though we have major differences in a number of areas, recognize that it is in both countries' interests to continue to have robust trade. China needs the quality food that we produce in the United States. I think we can also help reduce the air pollution issues in China with LNG and other products from the United States. And so my hope is that we can see both sides kind of tone down the rhetoric and focus on those things where we can cooperate and recognize that there are just some areas that we're, because of the differences of our political systems, probably not going to be able to cooperate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. Ed, actually, you talk about the Korea issue, and I know you've been at the Global Peace Forum and you visited South Korea, not too long ago. So what do you think about the prospect of how can we get this unification process going, or maybe on the Korea Peninsula, what can be done? I mean, shall we have 3-party talks or 4-party talks? What's your recommendation? I mean, how we can approach this hot issue here in Korea Peninsula?
Well, it seems to me the first thing that we ought to do is have, and maybe happening, but there doesn't seem to be any clear evidence of it. There ought to be a little stronger position from Beijing toward Pyongyang in terms of what is and is not acceptable behavior, because it's very clear who's keeping Pyongyang's whole very existence, economy, and therefore its defense and military capability alive, and that's the PRC. And that's a fundamental challenge. I don't know whether President Biden and President Xi talk about this in their bilateral conversations, but I hope they would. But it seems again to me that this is something that let's figure out how we come together, how we talk about it, how we try to convince people to act constructively and very specifically. Ambassador Branstad was front and center for 4 years on this, and he knows better than I what's going on behind the scenes. But I just very much, as an outsider trying to look at it, very much get the impression that China just lets them do what they want to do, and very much supports the whole economic system. So, we're up against it.
Also, more specifically too, I think we need a full enforcement of the UN resolutions. I mean, I don't know that we need any new resolutions. We don't need any new international agreement on what they should be doing and shouldn't be doing. I mean, we've already agreed on all that, but there's a lack of enforcement of that agreement. I don't think another round of 3-party talks, 4-party talks, 5, 6, however many we put at the table, I don't think is going to do anything. We need to turn the screws in ways that we always end up dropping off and not turning the way that we should.
Let me just follow up with what Walter said about enforcement of the sanctions on North Korea. And I think those sanctions can be effective if they are enforced, but that's certainly a concern. I was at Tumen on the border, in Tumen, China, on the border with North Korea, I think 3 days after the last nuclear test. So I know there are people in China that have grave concerns about the North Korea nuclear situation, as well as we do. Concerns about the possibility of nuclear fallout and everything else because it's so close to the Chinese border.
I think there are 3 brief points. I want to add 3 brief points on DPRK. One, I do not believe DPRK is a client state of China. I don't think so. It's an independent country. Secondly, China is firmly against a nuclearized Korean Peninsula, both in the south and in the north. We're against it. It's not in the interest of China, in the interest of the world. Thirdly, nuclear issue is not the only issue about Korea Peninsula. There is a issue of unification. And there's also issue of security for North Korea, for South Korea, for China. So I think we need to take a comprehensive view of all these issues combined in terms of Korean Peninsula, where we can find the peace, how can we enforce UN resolutions, etc. But our purpose is to establish peace on the Korean Peninsula.